Hi, my name is Emma, and I live in a small seaside town called Brighton Bay. Every morning before going to work, I walk near the beach. The sea is usually calm, the air smells like salt, and there's always a little cafe opening its doors near the road. It sounds beautiful, right? And it is. But for a long time, I didn't feel beautiful inside. I worked in an office. My job was okay, not terrible, that not exciting either. I answered emails, organized documents, and sat in front of a computer for hours and hours. And every day I asked myself the same question. What would I do if I were brave? If I were brave, I would leave my office job. If I had more confidence, I would teach English. If I weren't so afraid, I would start a small online class for students. But then another voice in my head said, Emma, be careful. You need money. You need security. What if you fail? So I stayed quiet. I went to work. I smiled. I did my job. But inside, I felt small. When I was a child, I loved teaching. I used to play school with my younger sister, Lily. I made little worksheets for her. I used a blue pen, and when she answered correctly, I gave her stars. One day, my mother saw us and said, Emma, you would be a wonderful teacher. I remember smiling and saying, if I were a teacher, I would help people feel confident. Funny, isn't it? Sometimes we say important things when we are children, and then we forget them when we grow up. Or maybe we don't really forget. Maybe we just put our dreams in a box, close the box, and tell ourselves, not now. Years passed, and my dream stayed in that box. Until one rainy Thursday. I was sitting in a cafe after work. The window was covered with little drops of rain. Outside, people walked quickly with umbrellas. Inside, everything was warm. Coffee, soft lights, quiet music. I had my notebook with me. I know, this may sound strange, but sometimes, for fun, I wrote English lesson ideas. Some people write songs, some people draw. I wrote grammar lessons. At the table next to me, there was a young woman. She looked worried, very worried. She had an English textbook open in front of her, and she was whispering to herself, if I were, I don't understand. I looked at her book. It was about the second conditional. I wanted to help her, but I felt shy. I thought, if I spoke to her, she might think I'm strange. Then I looked at her again. She looked tired, lost, and I thought, if I didn't help her, I would regret it. So I took a deep breath and said, excuse me, are you studying English? She looked up, a little surprised. Then she smiled nervously and said, yes, I have an exam tomorrow, but I don't understand this grammar. I smiled and said, maybe I can help. Her name was Sophia. She was from Spain. She worked in a hotel and she needed English for her job. So I opened my notebook and said, okay, the second conditional is not as difficult as it looks. We use it to talk about imaginary situations, things that are not real now or things that are not very likely. Then I wrote this, if plus past simple, would plus verb. For example, if I had more time, I would travel around the world. If I were rich, I would buy a house by the sea. If I didn't feel nervous, I would speak English with tourists. Sophia laughed and said, that last one is me. And for the first time that evening, she looked less afraid. Then I asked her, what would you do if you spoke English very well? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, if I spoke English very well, I would talk to guests with confidence. I would not hide behind my coworkers. And her eyes changed. They became bright, like she could see a new version of herself. I said, that is a beautiful sentence, and maybe one day it will not be imaginary. For 1 hour, we studied together. I explained the grammar with simple examples. I drew pictures, I made little stories, I asked questions, and Sophia listened carefully. At the end, she closed her book and said, "You are a very good teacher. Do you teach classes?" I looked down at my coffee and said, "No, I work in an office." She looked surprised. "Really? If you were my teacher, I would learn very fast." I smiled, but inside, her words touched something in me. That night, I went home and opened the old box under my bed, the box with my notebooks, my lesson plans, my stories, my little activities, things I had written years before. I sat on the floor, surrounded by papers, and I started to cry. Not because I was only sad, it was more than that. I cried because I understood something. I had been waiting to feel brave before doing something brave. But maybe courage doesn't come first. Maybe action comes first. Maybe we become brave after we begin. That night, I wrote in my journal, "If I waited forever, my dream would stay only a dream. If I started small, I could grow slowly. If I made mistakes, I would learn from them." The next day, I made a decision. I didn't leave my job immediately. No, that would be too risky, but I started small. I created a small online English class for beginners. I called it English Without Fear. My first video was about the second conditional. I was very nervous. My hands were cold, my voice was not perfect. I looked at the camera and said, "Hello, my name is Emma. Today, we are going to learn the second conditional. We use it to talk about imaginary situations. For example, if I were brave, I would follow my dream." And then I stopped for a second, because that sentence was not only grammar, it was my life. At first, only 5 people watched my video, then 20, then 100, and one day, students started writing comments. One student wrote, "If I had more teachers like you, I would enjoy English." Another one wrote, "If I understood grammar like this before, I would not be afraid of English." And someone else wrote, "If I lived in Brighton Bay, I would take your class in person." Every comment gave me hope. Every message reminded me that small steps matter. Then, one day, Sophia sent me a message. She had passed her exam. She wrote, "Emma, thank you. You helped me believe in myself." I read that message again and again, and I thought, this is why I wanted to teach. Not for perfect videos, not for perfect grammar, but to help people feel less afraid. A year later, I reduced my office hours. I started teaching more. I had more students. I made more lessons. And yes, I still felt afraid sometimes. Of course I did. But fear was no longer the boss of my life. Now, when I walk by the sea, I ask myself a new question. Not, what would I do if I were brave? Now I ask, what can I do today, even if I feel afraid? And that question changed everything. If I make a mistake, I learn. If I feel nervous, I breathe and continue. If I have a dream, I take one small step. And now, dear student, I have a question for you. What would you do if you were braver? Would you speak English in public? Would you travel to another country? Would you start a new project? Would you tell someone how you really feel? Think about it, because the second conditional is not only grammar, it is a door. It helps us imagine a different life. And sometimes, when we imagine something clearly, we take the first step toward making it real. So, repeat with me, slowly. If I believed in myself, I would try. If I made mistakes, I would learn. If I were brave, I would begin today. And that was Emma's story. So remember, we use the second conditional to talk about imaginary situations, dreams, wishes, or things that are not real right now. The formula is simple. If plus past simple plus would plus base verb. For example, if I believed in myself, I would try. If I made mistakes, I would learn. If I were brave, I would begin today. Now, I have a question for you. What would you do if you were braver? Write your answer in the comments using the second conditional. And if you want to practice more, I prepared a free PDF guide with the formula, examples, and exercises. You can download it from the link in the description. If this story helped you understand English in a more natural way, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And remember, English is not only grammar. It is also a way to express your dreams. See you in the next lesson. Subscribe for more grammar and listening practice through meaningful and emotional stories. Bye-bye.